Good afternoon, everyone. So glad that you could all be here with us today for the fifth panel on marijuana and social equity. My name is Sarah Sherman-Stokes, and I'm the Associate Director of the Immigrants' Rights and Human Trafficking Program here at Boston University School of Law, where my typical encounter with marijuana involves one of a non-citizen client of mine telling me that she's been convicted of a crime that renders her deportable. So I'm happy to be here today to talk about, I think, something a little more, some better news about marijuana, in particular, the ways in which we can think about the intersections of marijuana regulation, social justice, social equity, evidence-based research, and public health. I'm going to very briefly introduce this star-studded panel. I surely will not do any of them justice, but then I'm going to hand it over to them to give us about 15 or 20 minutes of a presentation, and then we'll leave ample time for questions, and I'll be monitoring the queue. So I'm going to start with Bo Kilmer, the director at RAND Drug Policy Research Center. He's also a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. His research lies at the intersection of public health and public safety, with a special emphasis on crime control, substance use, illicit markets, and public policy. His publications have appeared in many leading journals, the New England Journal of Medicine and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. He's had commentaries published by CNN, the LA Times, the New York Times, Newsweek, and on and on. He received a National Highway Traffic Safety Administration Public Service Award for his leadership and innovation in the areas of alcohol and drug-impaired driving program and policy research, and his co-authored work on 24/7 sobriety received honorable mention for the Behavioral Exchange Award for outstanding research. Following him, we will hear from Shalene Title, Commissioner of the Cannabis Control Commission. Shalene Title was jointly appointed in 2017 by the Massachusetts Governor, Treasurer, and Attorney General to serve in the social justice seat on the commission. Named to Boston Business Journal's 2018 list of the 50 most powerful people in Boston, she has won several awards for her advocacy work and her efforts to bring more women and people of color into drug policy reform and the cannabis industry. Before her appointment, she co-authored the Massachusetts marijuana legalization referendum, and she has consulted on state and local marijuana policy across the country. She also served as a founder of a women-led recruiting firm and as a founding board member of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, where she led the drafting of the first model bill created to give states guidance on implementing a process of reinvestment and reconciliation. And then finally, we'll hear from Nasli Maksudi, the Knowledge Translation Manager at the Center on Drug Policy Evaluation, where she plays a lead role in the production and dissemination of evidence-based drug policy research. She's been deeply involved in the development of evidence-based drug policies at the grassroots, local, national, and international levels since 2013. She's chairperson of the Executive Committee of the New York NGO Committee on Drugs, a global committee that supports civil society engagement on drug policy at the United Nations and represents over 100 organizations. She's also a strategic advisor at Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, having formerly acted as chair of the board of directors. I am going to leave it there and have Bo get us started in this fabulous conversation. Thank you all so much.
All right, well, thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. Before we jump in, I want to thank Jay and everyone at BU for putting on such an outstanding conference. And I've really learned a lot. And it really is an honor to be on a panel with Shalene and Nasli. I'm sure you'll hear about it, but Nasli just published a great report that I think is going to be very useful for the discussions that we have today and going forward about legalization and social equity. And I don't think there's anyone on the planet who's thought more about social equity in the cannabis space than Shalene. So I think we're in for a real treat. I want to begin by acknowledging that this presentation is based on some recent work that I've been doing with John Calkins, who presented yesterday at Carnegie Mellon, Michelle Kilbourne, who does a lot of health equity work up in Canada, and then two of my colleagues at RAND, Michelle Priest and Kristen Warren. This work has also been influenced by a piece I wrote with my wife, Erin Kilmer-Neal. She does a lot in the social equity space. So, talk about really loving your co-author. But this is very much a work in progress. So I welcome any feedback you may have at the end of the presentation, or just feel free to shoot me an email whenever it's convenient for you. Now, I kind of want to cover three different areas for the next 20 minutes. I want to begin by describing the evolution of equity discussions in cannabis policy debates. I then want to offer a unifying framework for thinking about how we can address these inequities with cannabis policy. I then want to conclude by talking a little bit about some of the trade-offs involved. Now, there are multiple definitions of social equity, and while some will use it as an umbrella term for all types of equity, for example, race, gender, environment, health, others will argue that it's just one type of equity that needs to be considered along the others, and that's one of the arguments that we heard during the first panel yesterday. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm using it as an umbrella term and focusing on the fact that equity is very different from the concept of equality. Now, when I'm going to be talking about equity, I'm going to be focusing on promoting fairness in ways that account for different starting points and also the needs of different populations as a result of longstanding systemic and legislative barriers to opportunities. This is kind of a definition I've cobbled together from a number of other definitions that are out there, but I think this really kind of serves the purpose for this particular presentation. Now, how has cannabis prohibition created inequities? I mean, primarily this has happened through disparities, arrests, and then all the downstream effects in terms of being held in jail. I mean, we've had other presentations discuss the collateral consequences that come with having a drug conviction beyond just having a criminal conviction. And multiple panelists have cited the data from the ACLU where they found that per capita cannabis possession arrests, even in 2018, were about 3.5 times higher for Black people versus white people. But I have to say that I've always found something a little, I've still wanted a little bit more from those ACLU figures in terms of not just per capita arrests, but also looking in terms of the intensity arrests. I mean, it's common knowledge that the past month prevalence rates aren't that different, but I've always wanted to know more about the intensity of use. And this is something that John Calkins had talked about. So I've been doing some calculations, kind of getting ready for this law review piece, kind of now looking and specifically focusing on arrests per cannabis use day and kind of looking at this by race. And sure enough, even when you do it by this measure, which really does account for intensity, we're still seeing a disparity of about 3 to 1. So now there are multiple factors that can contribute to these arrest disparities. Obviously, there's been a fair amount of research on policing strategies, for example, broken windows. We also know that Black Americans are more likely to purchase cannabis outdoors, which can increase the risk of arrest. Also, we know that Black Americans account for a higher proportion of cannabis buys. Now, it may be the case that Black Americans are just purchasing smaller amounts. We can't really tell that from the data, but this is something that would put them more at risk of being arrested. And then obviously racial bias plays a big role in these disparities. Now, in terms of the evolution of social equity in cannabis reforms, I'm thrilled to see kind of how this has evolved. I mean, early on, most of the discussion was focusing on reducing arrest and for those individuals who are incarcerated, kind of reducing their time behind bars. But kind of after Colorado and Washington passed, and as more places were kind of grappling with this, you then began to see more jurisdictions starting to talk about making it easier to expunge the offenses or seal them, kind of depending on the state. And this is important because as we talked about these collateral consequences where it can be harder to get access to public housing, other services, federal financial aid. Here expungement matters quite a bit. But then in more recent years, the conversations have increasingly focused on entrepreneurship and employment in the cannabis industry. And in fact, now there's very serious conversations about how we can use cannabis tax revenues to address these inequities. Now, one of the big questions, though, is, well, who should benefit from these different equity initiatives? Is it just those who are arrested or have been convicted for possession? What about sales? Maybe small sales, not large sales? Stepping back, should it be people who live in communities that were disproportionately affected by cannabis prohibition? And if that's the case, how are they going to be defined, or how are we going to define these communities? Some people also argue that we could use cannabis as a way to confront the other social inequities that may not have been attributable to cannabis laws. Now, should the targets be all of these others? This is really important because once you decide on the particular populations you want to focus on, I think it makes it a lot easier than to kind of tailor the different policy levers. So now I want to kind of focus on what we're considering kind of a unifying framework for thinking about this. And look, we're not the first people to do this. There seem to be an increasing number of different frameworks out there, different checklists that you need to think about with respect to equity. Adenoff and Ryman had a nice one, a couple published in 2019, work out of Ohio State as well as Brookings. And so we kind of looked at all these different frameworks and checklists, and then kind of also based on interactions we've had with policymakers who've been grappling with this, we decided to kind of focus on 4 different areas where we think that it's going to be important to think about the policy levers in these areas if you're trying to address some of these social inequities. One being criminal justice, the second being supply participation, the third being in government revenues, and the fourth being health. Now, in terms of criminal justice, obviously, one of the main tools is reducing arrests and convictions. And the research to date suggests that after legalization, you are seeing a large drop in cannabis possession arrests for adults. The research seems to suggest that when we talk about this with respect to juveniles, it's pretty flat. And in fact, Cashel Firth has been doing some work up in Oregon, suggesting there after they legalize, there actually has been an increase in cannabis allegations for juveniles. Now, I've only seen that there in Oregon, but it definitely seems to be having a different effect, which isn't surprising since the age threshold in all these states is 21. Other policy levers you need to think about are what are the consequences going to be for those juveniles that get arrested, but also public use. As I mentioned before, Black Americans are more likely to make purchases outside. And in places that have legalized, public use can still be a ticket, it still can be a crime. And so how you punish or how you sanction this or address public use is going to be important. And so that's why you definitely have seen some conversations in some places focusing on cannabis lounges and other places where people can use in public and not be at risk of arrest. And as we discussed before, expunging and sealing records. The big question here, though, is even if you're going to allow it, are you going to put the onus on the individual, or are you going to put the onus on the state? Because even if you make allowances for expunging previous cannabis convictions, depending on where you are, I mean, you have to petition the court, you may have to show up in court, some places you may have to hire a lawyer, and that really can create barriers. And so that's why you're seeing other places begin kind of taking this a step further and actually focusing on automatic expungements. And I know in organizations like Code for America and others, I think have been doing really good work in this space at trying to help states, kind of do the nuts and bolts and figure out, write the program to make it a lot easier to have this done automatically. And then another big factor will be enforcement against the illegal market. And as I'm going to talk about at the end of the presentation, this there's some tension here in terms of this enforcement and how it could actually affect equity outcomes. The second area is supply participation, right? Decisions about who gets to sell and supply and how much. Are you going to require those who get licenses to have a binding equity plan? I think Massachusetts is really far ahead on this. I'm looking forward to hearing Shalene talk a bit more about this and how it's working in Massachusetts. Are there going to be preferences for licenses or employment in the industry for these for those who are equity applicants? And another big kind of area of or kind of big decision that needs to be made is that are there going to be additional supports or outreach for equity applicants and licenses in terms of helping maybe some individuals go from the illegal market to the legal market? Will there be any type of access to lawyers? So there are a lot of other factors here that are going to influence these equity issues when we think about who gets to sell and who gets to supply. Now, I want to step back for a second and begin to think about, well, how many people are actually going to be affected by these different policy initiatives? And so this is actually based on some work that I've been doing with John and Michelle and Kristen and others for a state. Since this is being recorded, I can't name the state yet. It'll go public in a couple of weeks, but let's just call it State X, and they've got about less than 10 million people. And we kind of base these calculations assuming that there is kind of the standard commercial model that you see in a lot of states with no massive shock. So we're not thinking about federal legalization at this point, or whether or not a neighboring state opens up a pretty liberal market. And also for these calculations, we assume kind of standalone cannabis stores, because that's how this has been operationalized in the states that have legalized. Realize that these numbers that I'm going to show you could be very different if a jurisdiction were to eventually allow cannabis to be sold in grocery stores or other places. But in terms of thinking about the orders of magnitude here, if we think about expungement of adult cannabis possession convictions, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people in this particular state. We looked at the calculations, how many people have been arrested, and estimated for this particular state, if they were to expunge, it would affect more than 200,000 people in the state, including more than 100,000 individuals, 100,000 people of color, 100,000 people of color. So this could affect a lot of people in this particular jurisdiction. In thinking about kind of reducing the arrest, so this is more of a kind of a flow measure than the stock that I described above, but here we're talking tens of thousands. In this state, they have about 20,000 arrests annually, and granted, they did just decriminalize, but you still are going to have that police contact, which is something that needs to be considered. And about 40% of them are for Black Americans. So one could imagine that if they continued with prohibition, you still, over time, you could the number of people arrested for adult possession could still be in the potentially in the tens of thousands. In terms of employment in the cannabis industry, John Calkins he found a couple different data points to suggest that kind of a rule of thumb here is that there'll be one job in the industry for about every $50,000 in total sales. And so for this particular state, if they, it takes a while to kind of ramp up. So if we assume by year 4 that they were bringing in about $500 million in sales, that would be roughly about 10,000 jobs in the industry in that state. And now a big question is going to be, well, how many of these particular jobs are going to go to equity populations or those who live in disproportionately affected communities? And this is obviously going to be influenced by the policies of the state. In terms of number of licensed businesses, this is hard to estimate. I mean, just looking at kind of Massachusetts, which is a smaller state than the one we're talking about, but it actually has a higher prevalence rate with respect to cannabis. In July, they had up to what I think, over 800 pending and approved licenses. Obviously more will be added. And at the time, about 20, my understanding is that about 20% of them qualified as being disadvantaged business enterprises. And so, so if this state were to have up to 1,000 of these licensed businesses, I mean, we may be talking about just a few hundred kind of potential equity applicants who would be affected by this. Now, obviously, owning a business is different than just having your record expunged. But I think here, when we're having these conversations, thinking about the orders of magnitude here can be quite helpful. So kind of getting back to the framework, the third kind of area that needs to be considered is the allocation of government revenues. And so, a decision has to be made. Are you going to fund reparations or restorative justice efforts? I think someone had made a reference earlier in the conference to Evanston in Illinois, where they've set, I don't know if it started yet, but they've set aside that X% of their cannabis tax revenues are going to go to reparations for Black Americans. Will this money be used to potentially fund health services and programs in some of these disproportionately affected communities? And then once again, will this money be used to help, fund training and grant programs, for helping those who may have limited experience in the legal market, or for those who want to get more involved in the legal cannabis industry? These are all important decisions that will have implications for equity. And the final area I want to talk about is with respect to health. Now, we had a whole panel on this yesterday, so I'm not going to review all the health effects, the risks and the benefits, given the discussions we've had. But an important decision here is going to be, who's going to decide on the number of stores and where they're going to locate. And this is an issue because as the research comes out, we're finding that the cannabis stores are concentrating in minority communities and places with high levels of deprivation. And it's very similar to kind of what we saw with the liquor stores. And there's also some evidence now coming out suggesting that cannabis store proximity is associated with more frequent use. Now, of course, it could just be that these stores are smart and they're located in places that have more frequent cannabis users. And so it's kind of hard to tease that out. But this is something that we do need to be paying attention to. As I said, studies are ongoing right now, but I would not be surprised if you saw more studies kind of suggesting a similar relationship, especially given what we know about the alcohol outlet density literature. That said, I don't want to get too much into health, but I do want to offer a few quick thoughts about cannabis potency and health. Yes, definitely, if we look at some of the research that's being done on this, with respect to potency and health, some of these measures are crude or indirect. People may not necessarily know what they're consuming. And we also know that higher THC products, can be more efficient, and especially for those with some medical conditions where we may not necessarily want them smoking or vaping tons of flower. Some of these higher potency oils or some of the waxes, it's just a more efficient way of delivering the medicine. That said, I do think we do need a lot more research here focused on titration. So when I talk about titration, it's the idea of, say you used to smoke a whole joint that was 5% THC. Well, if it's 15% THC, we only smoke a third. Now, there have been a few studies that have looked at this more recently in Europe, but I haven't seen a lot being published on this here in the United States. And I think this is really important for kind of shaping the conversations that we do have about regulating and potentially taxing these high potency products. That said, there are two new reviews that just came out that suggest that we need to take the potential risks of these high potency products seriously. This a report just came out of Washington State, actually just this month, suggesting that they kind of reviewed the evidence and suggesting that THC content in cannabis products contributes to adverse health effects in a dose-response manner, and is particularly an issue for young users as well as those with certain pre-existing mental health conditions. And they're actually worried about it disproportionately affecting marginalized populations. And also earlier this year out of Colorado, you also had a panel kind of reviewing the evidence and suggesting that there was a moderate to strong connection concerning the THC concentration and the association with the mental health effects in adolescents, young adults, and kind of all adults in general. That said, they, when they focus on the concentrates, they found that the evidence was insufficient when examining the association to dependence and other acute health effects. But I want to be clear here that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I think there are a lot of people kind of doing work on this. But if we're going to be thinking about social equity, and I think health is inextricably linked with social equity, we need to be thinking about the potential effects of these some of these higher potency products. So I want to finalize the presentation by talking about some of the different trade-offs. And for example, if the target area or your target group is too large, this means there's going to be fewer benefits to share and a higher risk of helping those who don't need it. For example, if you focus on one community that's gentrifying, you may get people applying and end up getting licenses who weren't necessarily the original targets for the social equity program. So you have to be thoughtful about that. A second trade-off to consider is, if the beneficiaries are defined by the race or ethnicity, this could lead to legal challenges depending on the specifics of the program. We've seen some of these lawsuits be successful in Ohio. And in kind of preparing for this, I remember talking to some regulators in a particular state where they don't incorporate, where they don't make decisions based on race or ethnicity. And they were actually concerned that even if part of their social equity program was based on race and ethnicity, they were worried that there would be lawsuits against them that could then potentially shut down the whole social equity program. Now, I don't know how much of a fear that would be in other jurisdictions, but this is something that regulators are having to think seriously about in terms of designing and kind of targeting these equity programs. The third trade-off is, will increased enforcement against the illegal market exacerbate some of these inequities? So this is something we have to think about. If the idea is to shut down the illegal market, so then those who, especially the equity applicants, are more successful in the legal market, well, will that enforcement just end up leading to more inequities? This is tough. I mean, I think we could talk about civil penalties, but this is something that where there are going to be, serious trade-offs. Fourth trade-off, if you're giving a community a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities, this could actually increase the availability of cannabis in that community and potentially increasing the cannabis use disorder and some of these other effects. So this is something you have to think about. If the stores are going to concentrate in some of these, and a lot of these disproportionately affected communities, you have to think about some of the health consequences there. And related to this, if increasing supply is going to reduce the prices, which ultimately will influence the profitability of the cannabis businesses as well as public health. Right? I mean, one idea would be, we'll give out tons of licenses. We'll give them out to anyone who is an equity applicant. But if there's too much supply there, the margins are going to be so small, it can make it a lot harder for some of these small businesses to compete. And this is something that Rob had alluded to in his presentation earlier today. And kind of in following on something Rob said, I mean, this is really important when we begin thinking about questions about federal legalization. Now, when you talk to people who are in the industry, they'll tell you about, how federal prohibition creates all these headaches for them in terms of banking, getting equity, getting capital, taxes. But what a lot of the folks won't tell you is that the reason that they're actually able to stay in this business is because of the federal prohibition. And in fact, if we had federal legalization and it was legal to transport cannabis across state lines, you could see this market concentrating very quickly. For example, John Calkins did some work for this book that we wrote a couple of years ago, finding that you could probably produce all of the THC that's consumed in the United States on a few dozen big farms. That's it. So it's not entirely clear to me whether it would be in California or some other place, but this has really important implications when we think about the economic landscape and what it especially means for a lot of these smaller entrepreneurs. But what if we actually had federal legalization and imports were allowed? I mean, we still have flower still dominates most of the market, but the fastest growing segments are your extracts for inhalation, your waxes, your vape pens, and your dabs. So it may be the case that it may be more economical to grow the cannabis south of the border or on some island, extract out the THC and CBD and kind of other components, and then just ship that back to the United States. And the other issue you need to think about with federal legalization is, well, what if Amazon is eventually allowed to distribute? We've already seen what Amazon has done to a lot of the small mom and pop shops. So this is something that especially the state regulators have to think seriously about in terms of kind of developing these equity programs that are going to benefit the most people. So my concluding thoughts here is, look, there are a lot of different outcomes that do get discussed in legalization debates, and equity is becoming more prominent. I think the idea of reducing inequities is not really controversial for most people, but the trade-offs involved are really going to make these decisions harder. So ideally, it would be great for jurisdictions, if they could pick the target populations and then kind of run the numbers on these different policy levers before choosing them. And I know sometimes it's difficult with the way that the ballot initiatives get written, but ideally you'd want to do that kind of beforehand. And the final point I want to make is, we've got 15 states that have legalized non-medical cannabis. There will be more, but there are some places that aren't ready to have these conversations yet. But in those particular places, if it's possible to expunge or seal previous cannabis convictions, this could help thousands, tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of people. So I hope those jurisdictions will pay close attention to that. And so with that, I will close, and I look forward to hearing from my co-panelists.
Shalene, go ahead.
Thank you. First, I want to thank you, Sarah, and I want to thank Jay and everyone who put the conference together for putting together such a great lineup. I also want to thank my co-panelists, Bo and Nesli. I couldn't do my job if it wasn't for drug policy researchers. Your work is so important, and it has such a big impact. I can vouch for it in particular on this issue. I'm also very grateful to the research department at the Cannabis Control Commission. Dr. Julie Johnson has done a number of reports with her team that are on the website, which is masscannabiscontrol.com. So I want to encourage you to take a look at those reports if they're helpful. Really happy to be able to talk about social equity today. I usually, when I'm on panels, have to shove together all of Massachusetts, all the reasons for social equity and all of the programs into 15 minutes. And it's great to be able to have more space after that great presentation from Bo. I actually got to interview with Michelle, one of Bo's colleagues, and it's a privilege and an honor to see, all of the policymakers and the affected people that they talk to. We vomited up all of the information that we have to give, and then to see it in this framework with statistics is really useful. And I think it's going to be amazing for new states to learn from everything that we've learned in Massachusetts as the first state to try social equity. And of course, all the other states that have gone before us and everything we've learned about health and different policies. So today I'm thinking a lot about movements, because you can't separate racial and social justice as it relates to cannabis from racial and social justice in general. And when I think about where we are today as a country, for those of us in the United States, you can't help but think about how important movements are generally, but then also having been part of the cannabis movement for now about 20 years, how special it is. Because I feel like I'm in this microcosm where I have watched a movement play out, starting with legalization, where we stand on the shoulders of generations of activists who have been pushing for legalization. And then once we saw legalization be successful, to specifically change their efforts to make sure that we not only are stopping arrests, but that we're repairing the harms of the war on drugs. And that's essentially what equity is about. I'd say in 2016, when Massachusetts started, that was groundbreaking. That was completely new. Nobody was really talking about that aspect of cannabis legalization. But since then, I've been amazed to see how quickly it has taken off as a concept. More and more states are trying better ideas and getting more results. None of them are a smashing success so far, but they're trying more and more. We're trying more. And just as a conversation, which is really important, you cannot talk about legalization now without talking about equity. And I'm particularly thinking about this week because I'm looking at New Jersey. And something similar happened in New Jersey this week as happened in Massachusetts back in 2016, which is that once a referendum passed here, the House actually passed a bill. There may be some people watching who are paying attention in Massachusetts at the time. The House bill actually took our equity language, which said in the referendum that the regulating agency would need to develop policies and procedures to include, promote, and encourage the inclusion of disproportionately harmed communities and positively impact those communities. And it moved it to the front page, and it changed the shall to a may. It said the regulating agency may develop policies and procedures to blah, blah, blah. Essentially, taking out the equity altogether. It also added a number of new ways to exclude people from the industry. At the time, it was the fashion to exclude people with felonies, with including marijuana convictions. And in a lot of other ways, it just kind of stripped equity from the referendum. And there was a massive movement that had to be built, a coalition that had to be built basically over a weekend to stop that bill. It was stopped, but the same thing happened in New Jersey this week, 4 or 5 years later. And so it's really amazing to see that not only do we have movements where you build a coalition for equity, but then if you've been watching the following 5 years in Massachusetts up to and including today, those coalitions have to stay in contact, making demands of the regulators and legislators and making sure that equity stays at the forefront and the center. And if we didn't have both those movements and regulators who were very much committed to not just equity, but making policy that is fair and making policy that is evidence-based, then you wouldn't see all of these policies being tried across the country. You may have heard that just yesterday, a new Regulators Association was announced, called CANRA for short. If you look at all of those states, it's 19 states, you can see that we have people in power that are mostly very focused on not being political, not doing what politicians are generally doing in terms of marijuana, but they're closer to where the people are. That's definitely the case in Massachusetts. And so I think when you look at racial and social justice in general, you can kind of see a model, if this is successful, for what it would look like if policies were actually made by movements and the people who are affected by them and policymakers who listen to them. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about today as I'm looking at this framework and thinking about where we've been and where we're going in the next few years. So my framework is very similar to what Bo had laid out, but the grand equation for equity for me is that, well, first you have to take a step back and look at the different aspects of equity. I focus on business licensing because that's what the commission controls. But there's also the reinvestment of tax revenue, We just hit $1 billion in Massachusetts. I think Illinois is actually doing the best job right now of reinvesting their tax revenue, a full 25%, back into disproportionately harmed communities. The advice that I would have for states is to make sure that if you put that in the law, that you have a mechanism for it as well, because our law actually directs tax revenue to several different areas, including disproportionately harmed communities, but it's subject to appropriation by the legislature. And it is, there's no mechanism for it to happen in the law. Whereas in Illinois, they have an actual board that determines which communities are disproportionately harmed and then makes grants. So I think that's like at least 1/3 of what you need to be thinking about if you're trying to make an equitable cannabis legalization law. The other is the criminal justice aspect. As was touched on earlier, the racial disparities don't necessarily go away when the arrests stop after legalization. And in some cases, particularly among Black and brown juveniles, Colorado is one example, the arrests actually go up. So it's really important to make sure that you are watching the disparities, you're watching the arrests that are happening in other states, and then implementing decriminalization or drug courts or other measures so that you don't accidentally end up having even more of an unfair impact than you did before. Also, expungement is really important. I think it's a no-brainer that automatic expungement should be included in legalization laws. But I think there is sometimes an overemphasis placed on expungement when we talk about the criminal justice aspects of legalization, because there are so many more effects on people's lives that you can have from a conviction or from having been incarcerated. And that's its own separate thing that shouldn't be confused with reinvesting tax revenue or business licensing. Okay, so with that said, focusing on business licensing, it's generally keeping barriers low and then extra benefits for disproportionately harmed people to make up for the past harms and for the existing systems barriers. So that's really it. Like if you feel overwhelmed by equity, it's really just making sure that as you're making these decisions each day, you're keeping barriers low, you're adding extra benefits, and that's the most important thing. I think that it's a really good thing that we have so much detail now from states that have been providing data on what they're trying, like Massachusetts and California and Illinois, that we have this research with frameworks, because it's becoming so fashionable to talk about equity now that you could easily say, and I won't call out the state, but I have seen announcements of equity programs that essentially just end up being like everything stays the same, but if you qualify for the equity program, you get like 10% off of your application fee. That really doesn't make a difference, and that you shouldn't even be allowed to call that an equity program. So instead, what we need is a number of objective factors that we can use to evaluate whether a law is equitable or not. And an actual equity program is only part of that. I think there are a lot of other factors that you should look at to make sure that you're being equitable. For me, home grow is a huge one. I think that if you look at a state, if patients or consumers are allowed to grow under limited circumstances at home versus if they're not, that really tells you who's in charge in a state, whether it's the people and their rights and their legal right to possess and use cannabis, or if it's the corporations and dispensaries that are in charge that want to force you to buy regulated product. There are law enforcement factors that influence that decision as well, but in my experience, I think it's a good way to tell what is happening in a state is what's going on with home grow. I also think that it shouldn't be I think it should be a deal breaker when you're looking at a new law, because it serves as a check on so many things. If you can grow at home, then it's going to be a check on monopolies, on delays, on bad products, on all kinds of things that might temporarily or for longer go wrong in a regulated market. Local control generally is the other thing that doesn't get considered as officially part of an equity program, but very much affects equity. In Massachusetts, I would say it's the most important factor for whether our equity program will be successful. And it's also the biggest mistake that we made. And I will take that responsibility, being someone who wrote the law with my colleagues. I think we should have spelled out a lot more how local control would work, and that it should be equitable, and how the selection decisions would be made as to who can operate in a city or town. We should have also provided a lot more guidance from the beginning to cities and towns to help. I mean, there's always going to be fear at the beginning, but now, a few years in, our cities and towns are a lot more rational and a lot more willing to talk about equity because they've seen with their own eyes the impacts or the lack of impacts and the tax revenue that comes with having one of these businesses in your town. So it may just be like that is something that has to come with time. I don't know, but I would say I can be kind of a broken record on this, but you have to pay attention to local control. And if I could give you like the shortest solution, it would be to tie it to tax revenue. In other words, if you are equitable by allowing equity businesses to operate in your city or town, or you agree, like Evanston mentioned earlier, to direct a certain part of your revenue to disproportionately harm communities within your town or something like that, then you get your share of tax revenue. I think that would completely solve that issue. Also, licensing fees are important. Capital requirements are important. There are a lot of programs that make you show $500,000 before you can apply for a license, just in the hope of showing that they're able to go through the process. But that can obviously exclude people who don't have liquid capital, or they're having trouble finding capital. Generally, making the application process more understandable and shorter is really helpful in terms of lowering barriers. And for us, one thing that we learned after a few years is that if you can move the process around so that the location is needed far later in the process, you can save all of the rent that you're paying while you're waiting for your local and your state application to go through. So that's a recent change that we made for delivery businesses, that if you're starting at the beginning, it'll save a lot of resources for these companies, and it'll help small businesses have more of a chance. I'm going to close with the benefits for equity program participants in Massachusetts. But before that, I just want to really underscore something that Bo said, which is that health is inexplicably tied to equity. And I really wish that we talked about this more, both because it's true. Health is absolutely tied to equity, and we don't want to be on one side or the other in this false dichotomy of pro-pot or anti-pot, where you might be, if you're considered on the pro-pot side and you're trying to encourage businesses, you might be looking over actual concerns that we have seen from lessons that we've learned with tobacco and alcohol, because we're dismissing them as fear-mongering. We do not want to do that. We want to be more evidence-based and take those concerns seriously. And then at the same time, something we see especially on the local level is an attitude that it won't do any harm if you make things as difficult as possible for these businesses to operate. For example, if you completely prevent them from advertising, if you completely limit the zoning as much as possible, you have giant buffer zones around schools. What happens is, if you don't think about those kinds of requirements and make them thoughtful, then you end up making it so difficult to operate that only very well-resourced companies can operate. And then you end up encouraging and favoring the big influential corporations that you're trying to prevent from a public health perspective. So when we talk about movements, I think we need to be very united in terms of social equity and public health, especially as time goes on and these companies are consolidating and becoming more powerful and having more of an influence. So I'll close with the benefits for equity program participants in Massachusetts. This is very much evolving. And I think that as new states come online and they see that we still don't have data from any state that shows an equity program that has completely accomplished our goal, we need to think about what these states are doing as the bare minimum, particularly when it comes to federal legalization. So here in Massachusetts, we have fee waivers for equity program participants. We have technical assistance in terms of navigating the application process and running your business. We have 4 tracks because it's not one size fits all. Some people want to work in the industry. Some people want to work in the industry not at the entry or re-entry level, but at manager or executive level. Most people want to be entrepreneurs in the cannabis space. So we have by far the most people in that track. And then we have an ancillary track as well for software, plumbing, electrical, HR, whatever ancillary company you want to run. We have expedited review for social equity program participants and priority review, which is even more pronounced for economic empowerment applicants. And then our latest benefit, which I'm the most proud of, which I actually came out of a 5-hour hearing and it's still going on right now today to discuss, is exclusive access to delivery licenses. And that's been one that has actually brought out a lot of opposition where we previously did not have any opposition to the concept of social equity. Now that we've put aside a sizable piece of the market for these businesses, particularly when delivery is something that people are obviously very interested in because of the pandemic, there's now a lot of opposition. So we'll see. The final vote is going to be on November 30th, but I'll describe it to you. What we have is a courier license where if you want a company that is going to be a little bit simpler and require less capital, you simply take the product from the retailer to the consumer for a delivery fee, like a Uber Eats type of model. And then there's also a model where you're a delivery business that purchases wholesale from cultivators or manufacturers, and then you deliver and sell that product to the consumer at home, and you keep your products in a warehouse. So for 3 years, those businesses will be exclusively for social equity program participants who get the technical assistance to learn how to run that kind of business or whatever kind of business. They also have the pre-certification where we vet their applications first, and we give them a pre-certification that they can take to investors, landlords, local officials, and then leave those more difficult and expensive parts of the process for last. So I don't have a great conclusion because we're very much in the middle of that, but you can count on the commission to be transparent about how it goes and release all of the data that we can. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to tell you all about it.
Thank you so much, Shalene. That was fascinating. I'm going to turn it over now to Nasli.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate on this panel. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be alongside my co-panelists today. As mentioned, my name is Nasli Maksudi. I'm the Knowledge Translation Manager at the Center on Drug Policy Evaluation, which is based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And some of you might know us by our former name, which was the International Center for Science in Drug Policy. And while our name has changed, our mission really remains the same, which is to support the development of health and rights and evidence-based drug policies at local, national, and international levels. And we do that really through conducting research and outreach. So today I have the pleasure of presenting on a policy brief that was just recently launched. Bo said some kind words about it, so I'm glad that it's being well received in the field, and hopefully participants today will find it informative and useful. But this is really coming from the experience of Canada, which is, of course, a country that has regulated non-medical cannabis markets at the national level, but failed to incorporate any racial or social equity measures. And that perspective, I think, is a little bit different from the experiences throughout the US, but hopefully will be informative not only for this audience, but also for other jurisdictions beyond the US as well. So moving to my first slide here, this is just the agenda of what I'll be covering today and a screen grab of the policy brief I'm referring to. I will provide a tiny URL link at the end if folks want to take a look at the policy brief directly. So in Canada, like in the United States, we have had historical overcriminalization of Black, Indigenous, and people of color for drug offenses, including cannabis possession for personal use offenses. They've been disproportionately targeted, surveilled, policed, and funneled into the criminal justice system for these offenses for the many, many years, last 100 years that we've had cannabis prohibition in Canada. Now, while that is similar to the United States, I think a key difference in Canada is that we have not had the same level of public and general public awareness about the lack of equity and the disproportionate targeting of Black and Indigenous people, as well as people of color in Canada when it comes to drug offenses. And this is largely attributable to the lack of racially disaggregated data that we do have in Canada. So with that in mind, when cannabis policy reform came on the docket in Canada, there was not the same push from the ground up for racial justice and social equity measures that may have been seen in some of these other jurisdictions, largely attributable, as I said, to the lack of knowledge around this being the situation in Canada. Now, moreover, our Canadian federal government has not included anything about racial or social equity in their goals for cannabis policy reform. And I would argue that it's not because they aren't aware that even though we didn't have the data, lawmakers, law enforcement would have been well aware of the disproportionate negative impact that cannabis prohibition has had on these racialized groups. I think a key example to point to is that our chief of police in Toronto, which is Canada's most populated city, went on to become a member of parliament and become the cannabis czar. So you can't tell me that the chief of police, who is our cannabis czar, is not aware of this. It is well known, but perhaps because there wasn't this bottom-up push, there was also not this push from the top. Really what we found ourselves in is a scenario where there was no emphasis on racial or social equity. It was only in 2017 and 2018 where we had some new research that had emerged and was published, in which there was some discourse around the negative disproportionate impact, that we started to see some more public awareness, some more public knowledge, and some from the ground up push for the need for racial and social equity initiatives to be incorporated into cannabis policy. But it certainly was not part of the motivations from the beginning, either from the grassroots or the top down. So against that backdrop, we really sought out to examine the race and the gender demographics of C-suite level executives and boards of directors of licensed cannabis producers in Canada, as well as their direct parent companies. And our goal here was to assess whether the promise of an equitable legal cannabis market had been achieved. So while this wasn't on the docket at the beginning, as there was more public awareness, there was a discourse and there was recognition that there could be the possibility of using the legal cannabis industry to redress some of the harms of cannabis prohibition for racialized groups. So we wanted to see if that potential had been achieved. So our methods really involved systematically assessing all the publicly available information online on all the individuals that are occupying those positions I mentioned, the executives and the directors of licensed producers and their parent companies. And the reasons we picked those stakeholders is our perception that those have the greatest financial stake, right? We weren't looking at managers or people lower on, people working at dispensaries being racialized group, but those that have the most to benefit from the profits and the gains of this legal industry. Now, what we did is extract data on perceived race and gender using a standardized protocol, and it was done in duplicate by independent reviewers. So 2 of 4 looked at every individual, and they were randomly assigned. So no 2 reviewers were matched consistently throughout all their extraction, and this was to remove the possibility for bias. And I should flag as well that perceived race and gender was based on a photo. So just based on a name, we did not make any sort of judgment on what the race and gender was, but we had to have a picture of the person in order to include them in the sample for this analysis. So once we extracted all that data, we analyzed it to determine the overall race and gender demographics. We used some basic descriptive statistics, which I will share today. So moving into our results here, we screened 185 licensed producers and 57 parent companies, and we ended up including 222 organizations, so 166 licensed producers and 56 parent companies. And within these 222 organizations, we had 700 individuals, executives and directors. And you can see here that it was quite an even distribution between directors and executives, with about 1 in 10 having dual roles, which just means that they were both an executive and a director. So moving into the meat of what we found, the results around race. What we saw in our sample of 700 cannabis industry leaders was that 84% were white and 16% were non-white. Amongst the racialized group, the non-white groups, Black and Indigenous people were the most disproportionately underrepresented when you compare their representation in the legal cannabis industry to their representation in the general population. And of course, these are two key groups that have been over-criminalized under cannabis prohibition. Now, I wanted to add a little bit of nuance to this analysis, the 2% of Indigenous representation in the sample. This is largely actually attributable to a single LP, namely Atlantican, who has a parent company that is it's a chief of board. So it's exclusive, a board of chiefs rather. It's exclusively Indigenous people. And therefore, I want to flag that just to say that this 2% Indigenous is not representative of kind of the industry as a whole, that there is not the worst compared to some of the other groups, Indigenous representation. If you actually remove that one organization and their parent company, Indigenous representation falls to 0.6%. So they go from being the third most represented to the least represented. And I think that's important. We can look to Atlantican and their parent company as a best practice and an example of what we'd like to see more of. But certainly it's not indicative of the field as a whole that about 2% per LP would, for example, be Indigenous. That one outlier, if you will. So moving into gender and taking race and gender together here, what we saw is that 86% are men. And of course, white men being most common at 73%, followed by non-white men at 14%. And women were only 14%. And amongst that, 12% were white women and 2% were non-white women. So women of color being really vastly underrepresented in our cannabis industry leaders here. So I think these findings, anyone who has been following cannabis policy in Canada will not be surprised by these results, right? This is something that was anecdotally being reported previously by individuals that were in the field. This is the first time that we have the numbers to actually say, here's a systematic, comprehensive snapshot of the diversity in the legal cannabis industry in Canada, and this is how disproportionate it is. It was not a surprise to our authorship team. I think maybe it was a little bit worse than we hoped, but certainly this was an exercise in seeing something that we anticipated to be the case and validating whether that was true, and we were able to do so. So of course, as has been articulated by myself and others, it's the so what here is that this representation and diversity matters in any industry, right? If you care about social equity, racial equity, that is going to be key. However, cannabis is unlike any other industry. This is just not some regular product. This is something that has been criminalized for 100 years in Canada, and that individuals have disproportionately been harmed by that cannabis prohibition. So you really add insult to injury, don't you, when the people that were overrepresented in the criminal justice system are now the people that are underrepresented as the beneficiaries of that legal industry. I think that Black and Indigenous people are really still suffering the consequences of criminalization in Canada under the legal cannabis policy framework. Namely, they've been, of course, stripped of resources. So you can think of income, education, networks, the types of resources that are necessary to enter the legal industry. We have high barriers to entry, and the historical criminalization and experiences of these racialized groups is not going to have set them up to succeed and meet those barriers to entry in the same way that other racialized groups like white men may have been positioned to do so. And then moreover, of course, the overinvestment in law enforcement has meant divestment from the types of social services that would have been able to support and advance racial and social equity. So it's kind of two-pronged there in the ways that we still this suffering under the legal cannabis industry in Canada. Now, I did mention as well, women being vastly underrepresented. I think the women of color piece is really crucial too, about how vastly underrepresented they were. And all in all, diversity in the leadership of Canada's legal cannabis industry is really important to ensure that these historically over-criminalized groups are not excluded, and also to build services and products that meet the needs of a broader swath of the population in Canada. I think having people around this table, like the diversity argument is that you're going to build services and products that meet the needs for more than just white men. So that would be ideal, I think. And really what's happened in Canada, I alluded to in the background, it's that we've missed the mark on this. It really has not been a focus of cannabis policy reform in Canada. And unfortunately, the lack of embedding racial and social equity into cannabis policy reform on the get-go has meant that those types of inequities have been facilitated and perpetuated by cannabis policy reform in Canada. So in the policy brief, we make a number of key recommendations for policymakers. And I should flag that these are, they were tailored for the Canadian context. Right now, we just in October hit 2 years of cannabis policy reform in Canada. We had a two-phased approach, but it's 2 years since cannabis flower was legally regulated. And our governments at multiple levels are undertaking reviews, internal reviews and evaluations of their cannabis policy frameworks to figure out what's working, what's not, and adjust as needed and iterate as needed. So with that in mind, this policy brief was really coming out to provide this data and these suggestions at a time when our government is doing a review to really suggest and try to ensure that racial and social equity are on the agenda of the types of metrics against which they are evaluating their cannabis policy framework. Because as I mentioned, that was not historically the case. So there are some recommendations on the slide here. I want to flag that the first two here are really policy recommendations, right? The need for governments to adopt social equity programs and provide business and financial support. The ways that these can work have been described in detail by my co-panelists. So I think some of those same suggestions are the types of things we're thinking about here and the ways to operationalize them. The tax revenue piece, for example, had been discussed. However, I do want to flag, and Shailene alluded to this a bit, right? Having these in your law is not a silver bullet. I don't want to say or suggest in any way that that is the case. You know, our colleagues in US jurisdictions will well know that having these in your policy doesn't guarantee that you have racial and social equity. And there's a lot that goes into it after the fact. But I would suggest that having it in your law from the beginning builds in a framework, builds in a motivation for that you can build upon and work towards. And other kind of simple things. Equity is kind of baked into legalization from the get-go. In Canada, we're kind of playing catch up, trying to get this onto the agenda when it was not from the beginning. And we don't have the same avenues, I would argue, to advance equity than the states in the US, for example, that had this baked into legalization from the beginning do. So that I think is key to point out here. And of course, the final recommendation here, it's a recommendation tailored more towards cannabis industry participants, suggesting that private actors actually work to diversify both the racial and gender makeup of their executives and directors. So I do want to make some acknowledgements here. My reviewers, 4 excellent reviewers that worked tirelessly on this quite large behemoth sample size. And our senior authors, of course, that were critical in dictating this work. And I, of course, will acknowledge that we conduct our research, the CDPE being based in Toronto, on traditional Indigenous territories for the groups that are listed on my slide there. So I will leave it there today. I thank you for your attention. There's the tiny URL link that I promised. If you do want to check out the policy brief, it's just a couple pages. It will be followed by a peer-reviewed manuscript in the future, but we did want to get that out into the world and have these numbers to back what many of us well know and push for change. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much to our incredible panelists. This has been so illuminating, and I would encourage you all to drop your questions. There's a Q&A I'll be monitoring. You can also put them in the chat if that's easier. We've got a couple questions starting to come in here. So the first one is, I'll just read it out loud from Mona Zhang. A problem in existing equity programs is that incentives for large companies to participate in these programs end up pushing some of them to exploit applicants who qualify as social equity applicants. What policy levers are there to help make sure that companies are participating in good faith rather than signing up equity applicants to get more licenses themselves? Go ahead, whoever wants to take the first step.
I can start. So I think that I think as a general matter, you have to start by thinking about what the role is of private business in general in equity. And for me, I'm pretty skeptical of putting that onto private businesses. I think that if the government had the ability to wage this war on its citizens, that's very well documented, we have the ability and the resources to repair it as well. I think it's really on us. In Massachusetts, we require companies to have a plan to positively impact these communities in their own way, and they have to have a diversity plan as well. But I think the bulk of the positive impact comes from us. The other piece of it is making sure that companies are not having people who qualify for the equity program as fronts. And that requires a lot of investment on the part of the regulator. So we have invested quite a bit in making sure that we're defining control in a way that is broad enough to encompass all the different types of loopholes that companies might be looking for. And then we've also invested in the resources for investigation to be looking at the structure of these companies, their practices, their contracts. It's coming up a lot with the question of delivery in whether there might be technology platforms that will end up indirectly controlling these delivery companies. So we're getting ahead of that by our regulations, making sure that we'll be examining those contracts. So it's a good question and it's not an easy answer. It takes a lot of ongoing work.
I think you're muted, Bo.
I was just saying, I agree with Shalene, and definitely this idea of the equity plans. I mean, whether or not they could be binding. I mean, I think it's going to depend on the jurisdiction. Yeah, having the resources for these types of investigations is going to be important. And then another aspect, and this is something I alluded to during my presentation, was being able to provide free legal support for some of these smaller entrepreneurs. I think this can be really, having giving folks the ability to have someone read over the contracts. Because I mean, if because in some of these cases, people are signing on the dotted line, and then eventually they realize, oh wow, I was exploited. And so I think there's a lot that can be done up front, especially for the equity applicants that are looking for capital, potentially partnering with some of these larger companies, making sure that they have all the supports they need, so they're entering these agreements with a reduced risk of being exploited down the line.
All right, we've got a couple more questions coming in. Michael Cutler asks, how does underrepresented in cannabis compare to the population generally and to other industries?
I'd be happy to speak to that. And in fact, I'd love to, Sarah, to share. I have a supplementary slide about this because I do think it's often a question that comes up, and it's hard to kind of say stats. So I'd like to just show them if that's all right.
Yeah.
Let's throw it up here. There we go. So this is, of course, the Canadian context, right? So only speaking from that perspective. But here you can see in the second column, I have representation in the general population. And then on the right, representation in leadership positions based on those stats that I had presented previously in my presentation from our analysis. And on the far side of the last column here, I've kind of done a comparison to say whether it's over, under, or equal. So I did mention during my presentation that both Indigenous people and Black people were underrepresented. East and Southeast Asian folks are also underrepresented. You can see that here. I didn't flag that explicitly because my key kind of message here was to articulate that the groups that were disproportionately targeted are underrepresented, but people of color, including East and Southeast Asian people, are also underrepresented. So I think that is an important point to flag here. And you can see here, this is from Statistics Canada. We've modified this to be able to understand the representation of the general population. And it's quite a large disparity for white people, 11% more than their representation. Quite significant in my perspective. So I hope that can answer. And this is also available in our policy brief as a footnote. So if you want to see these numbers later and reference them and the reference, you can. Thank you.
Great. Bo or Shalene, did you want to add to that? All right, from Seth Blumenthal, this is for Shalene. What are some ways we can codify motivations for equity efforts in case leadership changes and isn't as supportive of equity in Massachusetts?
That is a great question. That is definitely something that haunts my dreams as someone whose term is ending. I would say two things. One is that we won't be able to codify it simply because anything that we put, especially around equity, racial, social justice, it's going to be written in such a way that you could not hold yourself to it. And so for that reason, we absolutely need to depend on public scrutiny, public pressure, and movements. And there's no taking that out of the equation. The second thing is very specifically on the delivery. For constitutional reasons, as all the lawyers and law students in the audience will know, you have to be very careful in how you craft benefits for certain populations versus others. And so for us, when we crafted the delivery exclusivity period, we were very clear about the data that it's based on and when it will end. The criteria is very clear what the commission will look to at that time. No matter who the commissioners are, it will be objective. And if those criteria haven't been met, the exclusivity period continues. You could broadly apply that to all kinds of equity benefits.
Great, thanks, Shalene. All right, another question from Julie Steiner. Does Canada have any legal barrier to cannabis industry entry for individuals with prior criminal records and or prior drug possession records? If so, do you see this in any way impacting the industry diversity?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a really important question. And yes, we do. We require criminal background checks for achieving the licenses, like a licensed producer at some of the top levels. You do need to pass a criminal background check. So absolutely, when we know that these racialized groups are disproportionately carrying these types of criminal records, of course, it's going to influence their ability to enter this field. And I think it's related to this question. I want to flag, because I didn't get into it in my presentation, but it did come up. We also in Canada, this is in line with why the fact that racial and social equity was not a key motivation. We have not had expungements. We have had pardons. We have had Bill C-93, which only came through after tireless advocacy from the ground up, not from the top down in any way whatsoever. And unfortunately, it only goes so far as record suspensions. It has a lot of limitations. It's only about simple cannabis possession offenses, which we know are very rarely the only cannabis offense that's recorded in an incident. It's also not automatic. Bo was talking about who is the onus on. It's absolutely on the individuals. And as of August 2020, there was some stats that came out that indicated that 428 people had applied for pardons. Only 257 had gotten them. And there's about an estimate of 10,000 people across Canada that could be eligible. So this is, an abysmal kind of proportion of that has been, it had their records, and pardons don't even go far enough, right? So great that they've had their records suspended, but that information is still available. And if of interest, I'm happy to kind of speak. I think in different jurisdictions, expungements versus pardon look a little different. But I think I'll leave it there for now and say that if we did have a better system for expungements, then I think that would be a way that we could mitigate some of the challenges with folks having criminal records and thus not being able to pass some of the high barriers that are necessary for involvement in the legal industry.
Okay, we've got a nice long question from Jay Wexler. So he says, if I'm not mistaken, the proposed legislation in New Jersey would prohibit home growing. I believe that's the case in Washington also. What are the rationales behind prohibiting people from growing at home? Is it about stopping diversion to the illicit market, making it easier for police to find and stop large illegal grows? Are the points of disagreement between supporters of home grow and those who oppose it factual? That is, they disagree on whether there would be diversion into the illicit market, or a difference of values. That is, there will be diversion, but the equity benefits of home growing are more important.
I can take the first stab. Washington and Colorado were the first states to do this. And I think in Washington, it was a political decision. I think people were worried about diversion. So by not including it, you may be able to get more people to support this at the ballot box. Since then, no other jurisdiction has banned home grows, except I didn't realize this about New Jersey. No, I mean, I think part of the issue is, people are worried about there being some diversion, but as Shalene talked about, now with the corporate interests, they're also worried about potentially losing some market share. So I think they're going to, I can see why they may be pushing against this. There's also an argument to be made about just in terms of the quality of the product. And, a lot of people that want to legalize, so they have something that's labeled, so they know not only THC, CBD levels, but also whether or not, there have been pesticides, if it's been tested for pesticides, molds. And so there are some people that will argue that, well, if we allow the home grows, we won't have as much control over that. Yeah, it's interesting that this has popped up in New Jersey, because this really hasn't been much of a conversation, I'd say, over the past 5 years.
I'll add to that. I was definitely subtly shading New Jersey. So thank you, Professor Wexler, for picking up on that. I'd say in my experience in Massachusetts, I hope that there is some data that comes out where you can see that, some of these imagined or perceived impacts of home grow in terms of diversion, whether they have or haven't come to fruition. I think that the one argument that I've seen that I actually agree with is the dangers of trying to do extraction at home. And so for that reason, we have a public awareness campaign in Massachusetts. If you ride the train or you're watching TV, you might see a commercial that tells you that what the limits are on growing at home in Massachusetts, and also to be very careful if you're doing extraction. I think that's really important. But I think a lot of those concerns are disingenuous. There was actually a trade association in New York when they were getting close to legalization last year that put together a memo for the governor that suggested that they not include home grow. And it actually said that Massachusetts had banned it, when of course Massachusetts has not. So I think that there are market interests and that they're disingenuous and that they often lie.
Yeah. If I can add one thing on to what Shalene said, if we go back to Rosario's presentation about Uruguay this morning, and there, the cannabis that you purchase from the pharmacies, it's regulated. I mean, I think it's no more than now 9% THC. At one point, I think it might have been like 2%. But she showed this. She had a bullet about a forthcoming study which showed that those who were producing at home or producing for the co-ops, where the THC levels were closer to 22%. So I thought that was really interesting there. And putting this in perspective, and I think this is something that Rosario was talking about, kind of before legalization, a lot of what was being consumed in Uruguay was very low potency. It was coming from Paraguay. And so 9%, I think, is substantially larger in terms of THC content than what they used to be consuming. But then you think about the 22%. So it's really going to also kind of depend on the context. And, and so far, for the most part in the US, there really you're seeing more discussions now in terms of potentially limiting potency. But, most places aren't, they're not limiting the potency on the flower or on the extracts. You do see with the edibles, of course, the amount of THC in each package and potentially for a piece. But I do think you're going to see more people talking about this, not only in terms of regulation, but also I think there are going to be more discussions about potency taxes, especially for the places that don't want to put a limit on this. And Canada's got a potency tax on their concentrates and edibles. Illinois has this threshold that it's a differential tax rate if you're above 35% THC. In Canada, in California, about a year ago, the Legislative Analyst Office came out and said, hey, legislators, you need to rethink how you've been taxing cannabis, and actually suggested a potency tax as part of this. And so even within it, there's a lot of different ways that you could tax as a function of potency, THC to CBD ratios. But if you set it up the right way, and it's actually kind of a progressive tax, you could potentially use that as a way to nudge people towards some of the lower potency products.
I'll just offer the Canadian perspective here on home grow and personal cultivation. Personal cultivation has a really kind of historical importance in Canada. It was really critical to our medical access. We have a long history of personal cultivation for medical use, particularly to address barriers related to price and access. So it was, I think, kind of baked in that we needed to have personal cultivation and home grow as part of cannabis policy reform, because it's something that was already happening. And so much, in my perspective, about legalization is not trying to compete with the criminal market, but rather take the things that are already existing there and bring them into the legal fold in order to effectively move folks from the illegal to the legal market. So what our federal government allowed for home grow was 4 plants per residence, yet like our other federal guidelines, if you will, provinces and territories have the option to kind of make those stricter. And there are 2 provinces, namely Quebec and Manitoba, that opted to operate total prohibitions on growing cannabis for non-medical purposes, personally in your own home. And those are the only provinces that have sought to do that to further tighten the limits from the federal government. But there are other provinces that have adopted kind of other ways to tighten those restrictions, such as if you're cultivating outdoors, like limits on the heights of the plants, things like that. But generally it is permitted in Canada, with the exception of those 2 provinces. And I'm not sure, I don't want to speculate on the reasons. I think Shailene really got to some of the pieces there in terms of market interest. I think that would be relevant in Canada as well, absolutely. But I can't speak with definitivity about why those 2 provinces opted not to.
Thanks, Nestle. We have a couple more minutes here. I have one more question in the queue, but if there are folks that have been kind of holding back a question and want to get something in under the wire here, now's your moment. Somebody asked, and forgive me, I may not be understanding this because maybe I don't know enough about social equity and cannabis, but someone says, McConnell's USSC may ban all racial preferences. Is that a risk to social equity? I'm not sure if that's in reference to McConnell talking about not putting marijuana banking in a coronavirus relief bill, which is something he said this summer, or if somebody else knows what that might be in reference to.
I don't, but I mean, the action right now is happening at the state level. So I'm not entirely sure, how that would actually affect what happens kind of on the ground in the states in the 15 states that have legalized commercial supply and legal sales.
Nasty, were you going to say something? So we don't have any other questions coming in. I'll ask one question, which may, in light of what you said, Bo, be a silly question, but I'm curious if we are seeing local and state level change that's making the biggest impact in this area. Is there anything that you could anticipate at a federal level with the new administration? Is that totally sort of, am I just dreaming here? I may well be. Or is there action that folks could take at a federal level that would make a difference when it comes to social equity here?
I think, I guess I'll take the first shot on this. I mean, federal legalization could look a lot of different ways. And even if you keep it prohibited at the federal level, you could imagine a scenario where the Department of Justice engages in, you could almost like contracts with states or agreements, essentially saying, like, this is still all illegal under federal law, but as long as you do A, B, C, D, and E, we're not going to intervene. Actually, so something that has a little bit more teeth than kind of the Cole memo. And I do think that even if they were just to do that, I think that could have really important implications for equity, because when you think about, moving from prohibition to kind of a legal model, in the United States, we've largely focused on this false dichotomy that it has to be for-profit companies to get involved. But you could imagine a scenario where you'd have state stores or a state monopoly. Like, a number of places have this for alcohol. I mean, they've been deregulating over time. And, especially from a health perspective, we know that the places with the state control have better health outcomes than those that are deregulated. But if we think about this in terms, forgetting about public health for the moment, if you think about this in terms of social equity, another advantage of having the state store model is that can then end up kind of keeping the prices high. Because, John Calkin showed those slides yesterday of the price declines, and they would definitely, further accelerate with federal legalization. But right now, that money, the profits then are going to the private companies. if you actually had the state store model, you could kind of keep those prices up. And then at the same time, the money coming in, there would be more money that then could be spent on reparations or on providing health services in disproportionately affected communities. And so, I haven't seen anyone kind of really run the numbers on this in terms of what it would mean for, for helping, really kind of building wealth in these communities. But getting back to the question, I think there are some places that are avoiding even talking about a state monopoly because there is this federal prohibition and they're worried about ordering their employees to violate federal law, where even if you had some of these contractual agreements, I mean, this is something that Mark Kleiman talked about years ago, it may then enable some of these states to at least further consider a state, state monopoly model, which I think could be better for public health, and it may be better for social equity. And people would still be working, so you could still give preferences for employment potentially, for some of these individuals who are from these disproportionately affected communities. I mean, I think there's a lot of thinking we have to do here, but I think there are, but I do think if you care about social equity, this is something we're thinking about.
Can I weigh in on that as well? So for now, I support the MORE Act. People who've been following it may know that it was set to be voted on earlier this year, and then it was postponed due to the election. So if that's something that you're interested in seeing, if you're interested in federal legalization, you can ask your representative now about the MORE Act and ask when it's going to be voted on. But more aspirationally, I'd love that conversation that was just started. I think that we haven't properly thought about how we can really merge public health and equity in federal legalization. I personally would love to see state stores, and at least one state should try it, right? And compare it to how everything else has worked. Yeah. I'd like to see something like potency limits across the board too, and just some consistency so that we can have data from different states that we can evaluate that's going to make sense. And then real quick on the last question, now that I think I understand it, if racial preferences were banned, I don't think that would stop social equity. We actually don't really consider race in our social equity program. It's either based on residency in an area that data shows was had disproportionate arrest rates or similar statistics, or it's based on having a conviction yourself. So you can actually qualify regardless of race, but understanding how disproportionate the people with convictions are, it looks how you would expect it to look.
Great. Well, I think with that, we're at 3:59. So I really just want to extend my thanks to the three of you for what has been just, I think, a really exciting and interesting panel thinking about these issues and for some great questions. Jay, thank you so much for organizing and asking me to moderate. Just really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.